The rain hammered against the windows of Lincoln Elementary as Sarah Martinez sat in her beat-up Honda Civic, watching her 8-year-old son Tommy walk toward the school entrance. What she didn't know was that in exactly 47 minutes, she would be standing in that same schoolyard, facing down 3 grown men who thought they could intimidate a single mother. They were about to learn the hardest lesson of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had been fighting battles her entire life, but none felt as personal as the one brewing around her son. As a single mother working 2 jobs, morning shifts at the diner and evening cleaning at the office complex, she barely had time to breathe, let alone worry about playground politics. But Tommy's behavior over the past month had set off every alarm bell in her maternal instincts. The first sign came 3 weeks ago, when Tommy started asking to stay home from school. Her usually energetic boy, who loved showing off his latest Pokemon cards and talking about dinosaurs, had become quiet and withdrawn. His bright smile, the one that reminded her so much of his father before everything fell apart, had dimmed to something barely recognizable. "Mom, can I just stay with you at work today?" Tommy had asked that Tuesday morning, his small fingers clutching the straps of his backpack like a lifeline. Sarah knelt down to his level, studying his face. A small bruise marked his left cheek, so faint she almost missed it. "Tommy, what happened to your face?" "I fell," he said quickly, too quickly, "at recess yesterday." But Sarah knew the difference between a fall and something else. She'd been on the receiving end of both throughout her own childhood and during her brief, disastrous marriage to Tommy's father. The bruise was too precise, too deliberate. "Who did this to you?" she asked gently. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. He was desperately trying to hold back. "Nobody, Mom, I promise, I just fell." Sarah's heart shattered, watching her son lie to protect whoever was hurting him. She made a mental note to call the school, but Tommy grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Please don't call them," he whispered. "It'll just make everything worse." Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed. She thought she was giving Tommy space to handle things on his own, to build confidence. She had no idea she was allowing the situation to escalate into something far more dangerous. The second incident happened the following week. Sarah arrived at the school to pick up Tommy after her morning shift, still wearing her diner uniform that smelled like bacon grease and coffee. She found him sitting alone on the steps, his new sneakers, the ones she'd saved for 2 months to buy, covered in mud and what looked like food. "Tommy!" She rushed to his side. "What happened?" "This time." Tommy couldn't hold back the tears. "Some kids said I smell like French fries because you work at the diner. They said poor kids shouldn't have nice shoes." His voice broke on the last word. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest like a tide. Not at Tommy, never at Tommy, but at the cruel reality that children could be so vicious about things completely beyond their control. She worked hard to provide for her son, and while they didn't have much, she made sure he had what he needed. "Who said that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dylan Hartwell and his friends," Tommy said, then immediately looked terrified. "But don't say anything, Mom. Please, his dad is really important and everyone likes him." Sarah knew the name. Dylan Hartwell, son of Marcus Hartwell, the real estate developer who seemed to own half the town. She'd seen Marcus around town, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by people who laughed a little too loud at his jokes. The kind of man who believed his money made him untouchable. "Did they hurt you?" Sarah asked, examining Tommy more closely. "They pushed me in the mud," Tommy admitted, "and threw their lunch at me. But the teacher didn't see it happen." Sarah's hands were shaking as she helped Tommy to his feet. "We're going to talk to your teacher right now." But when they found Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman seemed more concerned about Tommy's appearance than the incident itself. "Oh my, Tommy, you're quite a mess. What happened during recess?" "Some students were bothering him," Sarah said firmly. "They threw food at him and pushed him down." Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted uncomfortably. "Well, children can be quite rough during play. I'm sure it wasn't intentional. Tommy, you should try to be more careful around the other children." Sarah stared at the teacher in disbelief. "Be more careful. He was bullied, not careless." "Now, Ms. Martinez," Mrs. Peterson said with a patronizing smile, "let's not jump to conclusions. Children have disagreements. It's part of growing up." Sarah felt the familiar burn of being dismissed, of being seen as less than because she didn't have the right last name or enough money in her bank account. But this wasn't about her. This was about Tommy. "I want to speak with the principal," she said. "Principal Davidson is in meetings all afternoon," Mrs. Peterson replied smoothly. "Perhaps you could call and schedule an appointment." Sarah left the school that day, with Tommy's small hand in hers and a growing certainty that she was on her own. The system wasn't going to protect her son. If anything, it seemed designed to protect the bullies, who came from families with influence and money. That night, as she tucked Tommy into bed, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed too old for his 8-year-old face. "Mom, why do some kids get to be mean and nothing happens to them?" Sarah didn't have an answer that would satisfy him, because the truth was too harsh for a child to hear. Instead, she smoothed his hair and said, "Sometimes the world isn't fair, sweetheart, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what's right." What she didn't tell him was that she was already planning her next move. She'd spent years learning how to be invisible, how to avoid conflict, how to keep her head down and survive. But watching her son suffer was awakening something fierce inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. The breaking point came exactly 1 week later, on a Thursday afternoon that started like any other but would end with 3 grown men learning that some mothers are far more dangerous than they appear. Thursday afternoon arrived with deceptive calm. Sarah had finished her morning shift at Betty's diner and was heading to pick up Tommy when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief but chilling. "Your kid got what he deserved today. Maybe now he'll learn his place." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she pressed the accelerator, her Honda protesting as she pushed it beyond its comfortable limits. She arrived at Lincoln Elementary to find chaos in the schoolyard. A crowd of children had formed a circle near the playground equipment, their voices creating a wall of excited chatter that made Sarah's stomach drop. She pushed through the crowd and found Tommy on the ground, his lip bleeding, his shirt torn at the shoulder. Standing over him were 3 boys, Dylan Hartwell, Jake Morrison, and Connor Phillips. All 3 were bigger than Tommy. All 3 came from families that donated generously to the school's fundraising campaigns. "Get up, poor boy," Dylan was saying, his voice carrying the same arrogant tone Sarah had heard from his father at town meetings. "Maybe if your mom got a real job instead of flipping burgers, you could afford better clothes." The other boys laughed, but their laughter died when they saw Sarah approaching. Something in her expression made even the bravest of them take a step back. "Tommy, come here," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. Tommy scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his lip with the back of his hand. As he reached his mother's side, Sarah could see the shame in his eyes, not shame for being hurt, but shame for not being strong enough to defend himself. "What happened here?" Sarah asked, looking directly at Dylan. "Nothing," Dylan said with a smirk that was pure Marcus Hartwell. "Tommy fell down. He's really clumsy. Is that right?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several of the watching children unconsciously step backward. "Tommy just fell down and tore his shirt and split his lip." "That's what happened," Jake Morrison chimed in, emboldened by Dylan's confidence. "Maybe you should teach him how to walk properly," The crowd of children had grown silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had been supervising from a distance, seemed frozen in place. Sarah knelt down beside Tommy, her voice gentle, but her eyes never leaving the three boys. "Tommy, I want you to tell me exactly what happened. The truth." Tommy's voice was barely above a whisper. "They said you were a loser for working at the diner. They said I was pathetic for wearing hand-me-down clothes. When I told them to stop, Dylan pushed me down and said his dad could get you fired from both your jobs if he wanted to." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, not break, but click into place like a weapon being loaded. She stood slowly, her full attention now focused on Dylan Hartwell. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Is that what you said?" she asked the boy. Dylan's confidence wavered slightly, but he held his ground. "So what if I did? It's true. My dad owns half this town. He could make you disappear if he wanted to." "Disappear," Sarah repeated, tasting the word. "That's an interesting choice of words for an 11-year-old. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized weeks ago, but had been too intimidated to use. When a voice answered, she spoke clearly enough for everyone in the schoolyard to hear. "Mr. Davidson, this is Sarah Martinez, Tommy's mother. I'm in your schoolyard right now watching 3 students assault my son while making threats about their parents' influence. I think we need to have a conversation immediately." Within minutes, Principal Davidson appeared, flanked by 2 teachers Sarah didn't recognize. But more interesting was who followed behind them: Marcus Hartwell, Robert Morrison, and William Phillips. Apparently the boys had their own emergency contact system. Marcus Hartwell strode forward with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He was exactly what Sarah had expected: expensive suit, perfect hair, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Sarah Martinez," he said, extending his hand as if they were meeting at a country club instead of a school playground where his son had just assaulted hers. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Marcus Hartwell." Sarah ignored his outstretched hand. "I know who you are." Marcus's smile flickered. "Look, I understand there's been some sort of misunderstanding between the kids. Boys will be boys, you know. Maybe we can work something out." "Work something out," Sarah repeated. "Your son just threatened me with your influence. He assaulted my child and told him his father could make me disappear. What exactly are you suggesting we work out?" Robert Morrison stepped forward, a shorter man with nervous energy and sweat stains on his shirt despite the cool weather. "Now hold on, let's not blow this out of proportion. Kids say things they don't mean, do they?" Sarah turned to face all 3 men. "Because it sounds like your sons are repeating things they've heard at home. Dylan seems awfully confident about his father's ability to destroy people's lives." The crowd of children and parents had grown larger, phones appearing as people began recording the confrontation. Sarah was aware of the cameras, but didn't care. She'd spent too many years being invisible, being dismissed, being afraid. William Phillips, the quietest of the 3 men, tried a different approach. "Ms. Martinez, perhaps we could discuss this privately. There's no need to make a scene." "A scene?" Sarah's voice rose for the first time. "Your sons cornered my child, physically assaulted him, and threatened our livelihood. You want to discuss this privately so you can intimidate me the way they intimidated him?" Marcus Hartwell's patience was wearing thin. "Look, lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but—" "It's not a game," Sarah interrupted, "and it's not negotiable. Your sons are bullies. They learned it from watching you. And if you think I'm going to back down because you have money and influence, you've seriously misjudged who you're dealing with." Principal Davidson finally found his voice. "Perhaps we should all calm down and—" No, Sarah said firmly, we're not calming down. We're addressing this right now, in front of everyone, because that's how bullies operate, in front of audiences, using their power to humiliate people they think are beneath them. She turned back to Marcus Hartwell, and when she spoke, her voice carried 28 years of suppressed anger, 28 years of being underestimated, and 8 years of fierce maternal love. You want to know who I am, Marcus. I'm the woman who's been cleaning your messes for years. I clean the offices where you make your deals. I serve coffee to the people you think you own. I know exactly how you operate, and I know exactly what you're capable of. Marcus's face had gone red. Are you threatening me? Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at the school, and it was not a pleasant smile. I'm making you a promise. Touch my son again, threaten him again, or use your influence to hurt my family, and you'll discover that some people have nothing left to lose, and those people are the most dangerous of all. The schoolyard had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant, a moment when the natural order of things was being challenged by someone who had finally decided she'd had enough. The silence stretched across the schoolyard. Like a held breath, Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, phones recording every word, every gesture. Marcus Hartwell's face had shifted from confident to something approaching concern, but his arrogance was still intact. Listen here, Marcus said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating tone. You're making a big mistake. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Sarah pulled out her phone again, but this time she didn't make a call. Instead, she opened her voice recorder app and held it up where everyone could see. Actually, Marcus, I know exactly who I'm talking to. You're Marcus Hartwell, owner of Hartwell Development Group. You're currently under investigation by the State Environmental Protection Agency for illegal dumping at the Riverside construction site. The case number is EPA 2024-0847. Marcus's confident expression cracked. How do you... I clean the offices at the EPA regional headquarters, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've been emptying wastebaskets and cleaning conference rooms where your name comes up quite frequently. Funny thing about cleaning staff, people act like we're invisible. They have very interesting conversations right in front of us. Robert Morrison tried to step forward. Now see here, you can't just... Robert Morrison, Morrison Insurance. Sarah cut him off. Currently being audited by the IRS for claiming personal vacations as business expenses. Your wife's trip to the Bahamas last month, the one where she posted all those photos on social media, that was filed as a client consultation conference. Robert's face went white. That's confidential information. Is it? Sarah smiled coldly. Because I also clean the offices at Patterson and Associates, the accounting firm that handles your books. Your accountant, Mr. Patterson, has very loud phone conversations with his wife about his client's questionable business practices. William Phillips, who had been quietly hoping to avoid Sarah's attention, found himself in her crosshairs next. And William Phillips, Sarah said, turning to face the third man. Phillips Construction. Tell me, how's that city contract working out for you? The one where you bid 30% lower than your competitors? William's hands were shaking. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You underbid because you're using substandard materials that don't meet safety codes. I know because I clean the offices at City Hall, and I've seen the inspection. Reports that somehow keep getting lost before they reach the mayor's desk. The crowd of parents and children had grown larger, and Sarah could see recognition dawning on several faces. These weren't just random accusations. They were specific, detailed, and devastatingly accurate. Marcus tried to regain control. Even if any of that were true, which I'm not saying it is, you're a cleaning lady. Who's going to believe you? Sarah's smile turned predatory. That's the beautiful thing about being invisible, Marcus. Nobody pays attention to the cleaning staff. Nobody thinks twice about the woman emptying their trash or wiping down their desks. Which means nobody remembers to be careful about what they leave lying around. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital camera. Nothing fancy, just a basic model she'd bought for Tommy's school events. This little camera has been very useful over the past few months. See, I started taking pictures of interesting documents I found in wastebaskets. Just as insurance, you understand. A single mother can't be too careful. The three men exchanged panicked glances. Marcus's face had gone from red to pale grey. "You're talking about theft," he said desperately. "Breaking and entering, industrial espionage." "Am I?" Sarah's voice was deadly calm. "I'm talking about trash. Garbage that was thrown away, abandoned, left for the cleaning staff to dispose of. There's no expectation of privacy for trash, Marcus. Even you should know that." She turned to address the growing crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the schoolyard. "These three men think they can intimidate a single mother because they have money and influence. They think they can let their children terrorize mine because they believe they're untouchable. But here's what they don't understand. When you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to gain." Robert Morrison was visibly sweating now. "What do you want?" "I want your sons to apologize to my son. Publicly. Right now. And I want all three of you to understand that if Tommy is ever bothered again, if he so much as looked at wrong, those photographs and documents I've collected will find their way to the appropriate authorities." "You're bluffing," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah scrolled through her phone and showed him the screen. "The EPA tip line. One call, and they'll have enough evidence to shut down your entire operation. Your investors will flee, your permits will be revoked, and your reputation will be destroyed." She turned to Robert. "The IRS fraud hotline. They offer rewards for tips about tax evasion. I could use the extra money." Finally, she faced William. "And the mayor's office. Imagine his surprise when he discovers that the city inspector who's been signing off on your substandard work has been taking bribes. The inspector, whose name is all over those lost reports." The three men stood frozen, their entire world crumbling around them in the space of 60 seconds. Their sons, who had been watching from the sidelines, were now crying, not from physical pain, but from the sudden realization that their fathers weren't the powerful, untouchable figures they'd believed them to be. Dylan Hartwell, his face streaked with tears, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Tommy, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Jake Morrison and Connor Phillips followed, their apologies coming between sobs as they finally understood the magnitude of what they'd done. But Sarah wasn't finished. She turned back to the three fathers, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally claimed her power. "There's one more thing you need to understand. I may be a cleaning lady and a diner waitress, but I'm also a mother. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, more dangerous than a mother protecting her child. You forgot that people like me exist. You forgot that we see everything, hear everything, and remember everything." She knelt down and hugged Tommy, who was staring at his mother with something approaching awe. "You wanted to know who I am," Sarah said, standing and facing the three men one final time. "I'm the woman who's been invisible for too long, but I'm not invisible anymore, and neither is my son." As the crowd began to disperse, phones still recording, Sarah Martinez walked away from Lincoln Elementary with her head held high for the first time in years. Behind her, three of the most powerful men in town stood in stunned silence, their carefully constructed world of privilege and intimidation lying in ruins around them. The battle was over, and for once, the underdog had won. The video went viral within hours. By evening, the confrontation at Lincoln Elementary had been viewed over 2 million times across various social media platforms. The footage showed everything: Sarah's devastating Revelations. The three powerful men reduced to stammering panic and their sons' tearful apologies. But more importantly, it captured something that resonated with millions of viewers. The moment when someone who had been invisible finally stepped into the light. Sarah discovered her newfound fame when her phone started buzzing incessantly during her evening shift at the office complex. Text messages from numbers she didn't recognize flooded her inbox. The first few were from local news stations requesting interviews. Then came messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, distant relatives, even her ex-husband's sister expressing support. But it was Tommy's reaction that mattered most. When she picked him up from his after-school program, he was beaming with a confidence she hadn't seen in months. "Mom, everyone's talking about what you did," he said, practically bouncing in his seat. "Mrs. Chen said you were like a superhero. And Kevin Williams, you know, the kid in 5th grade who gets picked on sometimes, he said his mom wants to meet you." Sarah smiled, but her mind was already racing ahead to the potential consequences. Taking on the three most influential families in town wasn't without risk, even with the evidence she'd gathered. Her concerns proved justified when she arrived at Betty's diner the next morning to find her boss, Betty Kowalski, waiting with a grim expression. "Sarah, we need to talk," Betty said, gesturing toward the back office. Sarah's stomach dropped. Betty was a good woman, but she was also a business owner who couldn't afford to alienate customers if the Hartwells, Morrisons, or Phillips families decided to make trouble. "I suppose you want my resignation," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from Betty's desk. Betty stared at her for a long moment, then broke into a grin. "Are you kidding me? After what you did yesterday, I'm giving you a raise. Do you have any idea how many people have called asking about you? 3 different news stations want to interview you here at the diner. The mayor's office called. Apparently they're very interested in those construction documents you mentioned." Sarah blinked in surprise. What? Honey, you've become the voice of every working parent in this town who's ever felt powerless. Marcus Hartwell has been throwing his weight around for years, making people afraid to speak up. You just showed everyone that bullies can be beaten. The next few days brought a whirlwind of unexpected developments. The EPA investigation into Hartwell development accelerated dramatically after receiving an anonymous tip with detailed photographic evidence. The IRS launched a full audit of Morrison Insurance, and the city suspended all contracts with Phillips Construction pending a review of safety violations. But the most surprising change came from within Lincoln Elementary itself. Principal Davidson, who had spent years tiptoeing around influential parents, suddenly found his backbone. Dylan Hartwell, Jake Morrison, and Connor Phillips were suspended for a week and required to attend counseling sessions about bullying and its consequences. More importantly, the school implemented a new zero-tolerance policy for bullying, with clear consequences, regardless of a student's family background. Mrs. Peterson, the teacher who had dismissed Tommy's concerns, was quietly transferred to administrative duties. Sarah found herself at the center of a movement she never intended to start. Parents approached her in grocery stores, sharing their own stories of children being bullied by kids from wealthy families. A local attorney named Maria Gonzalez offered to represent her pro bono if any of the 3 families tried to retaliate legally. "What you did was brilliant," Maria explained during their meeting. "You didn't break any laws, but you exposed theirs. The evidence you collected is legally admissible because it was discarded property, and your revelations have already triggered legitimate investigations." The most unexpected call came from Jennifer Walsh, an investigative journalist from the state capitol. "Ms. Martinez, I've been following your story and I believe it's part of a larger pattern. I'm working on a series about corruption in small-town politics, and I think your situation might be the key to exposing a network that extends far beyond your local community." Sarah agreed to meet with Jennifer, curious about what she'd discovered. The journalist's research revealed that the three families weren't just local bullies. They were part of a systematic corruption scheme involving city contracts, environmental violations, and tax evasion that had been operating for years. "The beautiful thing about your approach," Jennifer explained, "is that you gathered evidence they never thought anyone would see. You've handed us a roadmap to take down an entire network." As the weeks passed, the three families' empires began to crumble. Marcus Hartwell's development company lost its major investors and faced multiple lawsuits. Robert Morrison's insurance agency was under federal investigation, and several clients had already jumped ship. William Phillips discovered that his construction business was worthless without city contracts, and his reputation for safety violations made it impossible to find work elsewhere. But the real victory wasn't in their downfall. It was in the transformation of Tommy and the other children who had been bullied. Dylan, Jake, and Connor, stripped of their father's protection and forced to face consequences, became different kids entirely. Dylan, in particular, made genuine efforts to befriend Tommy, and Sarah watched in amazement as her son navigated his new social dynamic with growing confidence. The most touching moment came during a school assembly about bullying prevention. Tommy, who had been too afraid to speak up for himself just months earlier, stood before the entire school and shared his story. "My mom taught me that being different isn't something to be ashamed of," he said, his voice clear and strong. "She works really hard to take care of me, and I'm proud of her. If someone tries to make you feel bad about who you are or where you come from, remember that their words can't change your worth." The applause was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. She was too busy wiping away tears of pride and joy. 3 months after the confrontation at Lincoln Elementary, Sarah Martinez found herself in a position she never could have imagined. The media attention had led to job offers from several companies impressed by her intelligence and integrity. She'd accepted a position as a community liaison for the State Environmental Protection Agency, a role that would use her insights into local corruption while paying 3 times what she'd made at her 2 previous jobs combined. More importantly, she'd found her voice. The shy, intimidated single mother who had spent years trying to be invisible had become an advocate for working families throughout the region. She spoke at school board meetings, testified before state committees, and had even been invited to address a national conference about workplace empowerment. But perhaps the greatest change was in her relationship with Tommy. The boy who had once been afraid to tell his mother about being bullied now shared everything with her. They'd become true partners, and Sarah realized that by standing up for him, she'd taught him the most important lesson of all, that every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect. The last time she saw Marcus Hartwell, he was loading boxes into his car outside his former office building. Their eyes met across the parking lot, and for a moment Sarah felt a flicker of the old fear. Then she remembered who she was now, not the invisible cleaning lady, but Sarah Martinez, the woman who had taken on the most powerful people in town. And won. She nodded politely and walked on, her head held high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because she'd learned the most important truth of all. Sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary things. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the state capitol, preparing to deliver testimony that would reshape anti-bullying legislation across the entire state. The journey from that rainy Thursday at Lincoln Elementary to this moment had been more extraordinary than anything she could have imagined. The invitation to testify came from Senator Patricia Reynolds, who had been following the investigation that Sarah's revelations had triggered. The corruption network uncovered by journalist Jennifer Walsh had reached into multiple school districts, city governments, and even state contracts. What started as a mother protecting her son had evolved into the largest anti-corruption case in the state's recent history. Ms. Martinez, Senator Reynolds had said during their preliminary meeting, your actions have exposed a systematic problem that goes far beyond one school or one town. We need people like you to help us understand how to prevent this from happening elsewhere. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with legal experts and education advocates to craft testimony that would translate her personal experience into policy recommendations. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, legislators, educators, parents, and media representatives, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves that reminded her of the woman she used to be. Then she spotted Tommy in the gallery, sitting with her mother, who had driven up from Phoenix to witness this historic moment. Tommy gave her a thumbs up and mouthed, "You've got this, Mom," and Sarah felt her confidence surge. "Honorable members of the committee," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here today not as an expert or an activist, but as a mother who discovered that sometimes the system designed to protect our children actually protects their tormentors instead." She outlined the failures she'd witnessed: teachers who looked the other way, administrators who prioritized donors over students, and a culture that allowed wealthy families to buy immunity for their children's cruel behavior. But more importantly, she presented solutions. We need legislation that removes financial influence from disciplinary decisions. We need mandatory reporting systems that can't be buried by powerful parents. And we need to recognize that bullying is often a symptom of larger corruption within our institutions. During the question period, Senator Michael Thornton, known for his skeptical approach to new legislation, challenged her directly. "Ms. Martinez, while your story is compelling, how do we know that your experience represents a widespread problem rather than an isolated incident?" Sarah had anticipated this question. She pulled out a tablet and displayed statistics that Jennifer Walsh had helped her compile. "Senator, since my story became public, we've received over 3,000 similar reports from parents across 12 states. The pattern is consistent: wealthy families using their influence to shield their children from consequences while targeting children from working-class families." She clicked to the next slide. "In the past 6 months, investigations triggered by our case have uncovered corruption in 47 school districts, resulting in 18 criminal indictments and policy changes affecting over 200,000 students." The numbers spoke for themselves, but Sarah wasn't finished. "More importantly, we've seen measurable changes in schools that have implemented the reforms we're proposing. Bullying incidents have decreased by 37%. Academic performance has improved across all demographic groups, and parent satisfaction with school administration has reached record highs." Senator Reynolds leaned forward. "Ms. Martinez, can you speak to the long-term impact on the children involved, both the victims and the perpetrators?" Sarah smiled, thinking of the unexpected friendship that had developed between Tommy and Dylan Hartwell. "The most remarkable change has been in the children themselves. When we remove the protection that wealth and influence provide, when we hold all children to the same standards, something beautiful happens. The bullies learn empathy, and the victims find their voices." She shared the story of Dylan's transformation, how the boy who had once terrorized Tommy was now volunteering at a local literacy program, using his leadership skills to help younger children with their reading instead of intimidating them. Dylan's father may have lost his business empire, but Dylan gained something more valuable: the ability to connect with others through kindness rather than fear. That's a lesson that will serve him for the rest of his life. After the hearing, Sarah was approached by Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who had been studying the long-term effects of the reforms implemented in Lincoln Elementary and other schools in their district. Sarah, I wanted to share some findings from our study. The children who were involved in bullying situations before your intervention, both victims and perpetrators, are showing remarkable improvements in emotional regulation, academic performance, and social relationships. Dr. Foster pulled out her research tablet. Tommy specifically has become a case study in resilience. His confidence levels have increased dramatically, but more interestingly, he's developed what we call protective leadership. He's begun standing up for other children who are being bullied. This didn't surprise Sarah. Just last week, Tommy had come home and told her about helping a new student who was being teased for his accent. The boy who had once been too afraid to defend himself was now protecting others. The most significant finding, Dr. Foster continued, is that children who witness successful intervention against bullying, like what happened in your schoolyard, are 60% more likely to report bullying when they see it. Your actions created a culture shift that extends far beyond the children directly involved. As the months passed, Sarah found herself at the center of a national movement. The Martinez method, as some media outlets had dubbed it, was being studied and implemented in school districts across the country. The approach focused on transparency, accountability, and removing financial influence from educational decisions. But with fame came unexpected challenges. Sarah received death threats from people who felt she had overstepped her boundaries. Some wealthy families from other districts attempted to discredit her through private investigators and media attacks. There were nights when she questioned whether speaking up had been worth the cost. The answer came during a speaking engagement at a high school in Detroit. After her presentation about empowerment and standing up to corruption, a teenage girl approached her with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Martinez, I just wanted to thank you. I've been dealing with bullies at my school for 2 years. Their parents are big donors, and nobody would listen to me. But after seeing your story, I started documenting everything, just like you did. Last week, I finally had enough evidence to get them suspended. For the first time in 2 years, I'm not afraid to go to school." Moments like these reminded Sarah why she'd chosen this path. Her personal battle had become something much larger, a blueprint for ordinary people to challenge systems that seemed too powerful to defeat. The most unexpected development came when Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government invited her to participate in a fellowship program focused on grassroots leadership and social change. The offer came with a full scholarship and the opportunity to study policy implementation on a national scale. "Mom," Tommy said when she told him about the opportunity, "you should totally do it. You could help even more kids like me." Sarah looked at her son, now confident, articulate, and passionate about justice, and realized that her greatest achievement wasn't taking down corrupt families or changing legislation. It was raising a child who understood that power should be used to protect the vulnerable, not exploit them. As she prepared to begin this new chapter, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been invisible, a single mother working 2 jobs, trying desperately to stay below the radar of people she believed were more powerful than her. Now she understood that real power didn't come from money or influence. It came from courage, from truth, and from the willingness to stand up when standing up was difficult. She had learned that sometimes the most ordinary people, armed with nothing but determination and evidence, could change the world. The ripple effects of that Thursday afternoon at Lincoln Elementary continued to spread, touching lives in ways Sarah was still discovering. And she was just getting started. 1 year after the Lincoln Elementary confrontation, Sarah Martinez discovered that her battle against corruption was far from over. What she thought was a local problem had revealed itself as part of a sophisticated network that stretched across state lines, involving not just individual bullies and their families, but entire systems designed to protect wealth and privilege at the expense of ordinary families. The revelation came through an encrypted email from someone calling themselves Deep Throat 2.0, a reference that made Sarah smile despite the serious nature of the message. The sender claimed to be a federal employee who had been following the investigations triggered by Sarah's original exposure. Ms. Martinez, the email read, "What you uncovered in your town is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a coordinated effort involving multiple states to suppress evidence of systemic bullying and corruption in public institutions. Your success has made you a target, and there are people actively working to discredit and silence you before you can expose the full scope of what's happening." Sarah initially dismissed the message as the work of a conspiracy theorist, but the sender included specific details about recent attempts to undermine her credibility that hadn't been made public. Someone had tried to access her employment records. From the EPA, private investigators had been asking questions about her financial history. Most disturbing, there had been inquiries about Tommy's school records and medical information. She decided to share the email with Jennifer Walsh, the investigative journalist who had become both a colleague and a trusted friend throughout this journey. "Sarah, this aligns with some information I've been receiving from sources in Washington," Jennifer said during their secure video call. "There's apparently a consulting firm called Strategic Solutions Group that specializes in reputation management for wealthy families involved in scandals. They've been hired to neutralize what they're calling the Martinez problem." The next phase of Sarah's education in institutional corruption began when she attended a national conference on educational reform in Chicago. She was scheduled to deliver a keynote address about grassroots activism, but the real learning happened in the hallways and hotel bars where other reformers shared their own horror stories. Dr. Rebecca Chen, an education researcher from California, pulled Sarah aside during a coffee break. "I need to warn you about something," Dr. Chen said quietly. "I've been studying the patterns you've exposed, but across multiple states. There's evidence of a systematic effort to silence parents and educators who try to expose corruption. 3. People who were planning to testify about similar situations have suddenly faced IRS audits, custody challenges, or trumped-up criminal charges." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying they're targeting people legally?" "I'm saying they're using the system against people who try to expose the system. Your situation got too much public attention for them to use their usual tactics, but they're adapting their approach." That evening, Sarah received a phone call that confirmed her worst fears. The caller identified himself as Agent Marcus Rodriguez from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. "Ms. Martinez, we need to meet. There are some things you need to know about the people you've been fighting and some precautions you need to take." They met the next morning in Rodriguez's hotel room, which he'd swept for listening devices before Sarah arrived. "What you stumbled onto through your son's bullying situation," Rodriguez explained, "is part of what we call a wealth protection network. These aren't just individual corrupt families. They're part of an organized system that spans multiple states and involves everyone, from local politicians to federal contractors." He showed her a complex organizational chart that looked like something from a crime thriller. At the center were 3 consulting firms that specialized in protecting wealthy families from legal and social consequences. Connected to them were private investigators, corrupt officials, complicit media figures, and what Rodriguez called pressure specialists, people who made problems disappear through intimidation and manipulation. The Hartwell, Morrison, and Phillips families weren't operating independently, Rodriguez continued. They were clients of this network. When you exposed them, you didn't just take down 3 local corrupt families. You damaged a system that generates hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Sarah stared at the chart, trying to process what she was seeing. So all of this, the bullying, the cover-ups, the intimidation, it's organized. It's a business model, Rodriguez confirmed. Wealthy families pay these firms to ensure their children never face real consequences for their actions. The firms then use a combination of legal pressure, financial influence, and social manipulation to protect their clients. What makes your case unique is that you found a way to fight back that they hadn't encountered before. Rodriguez explained that Sarah's method, using her position as cleaning staff to gather evidence, had caught the network completely off guard. They were used to dealing with direct confrontations that they could shut down through traditional channels of influence and intimidation. The problem is, they've studied your approach now, Rodriguez warned. They're developing countermeasures, and they're sharing information about how to prevent future Martinez situations from occurring. The conversation took an even more serious turn when Rodriguez revealed that federal authorities had been monitoring communications between various network members, and Sarah's name had come up repeatedly in discussions about damage control and neutralization strategies. "We believe you're safe for now because of your public profile," Rodriguez said, "but we're concerned about escalation. These people have resources that most individuals can't imagine, and they're not used to losing." Sarah left the meeting with a new understanding of the stakes involved. What had started as a mother protecting her child had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The full scope of the threat became clear 2 weeks later when Sarah discovered that someone had attempted to hack into Tommy's school computer account, trying to plant inappropriate materials that could be used to discredit her parenting. The attempt was sophisticated, but ultimately unsuccessful thanks to new cybersecurity measures the school had implemented after previous incidents. More troubling was the sudden appearance of protesters outside her speaking engagements. These weren't grassroots opponents. They were too well organized, too well funded, and their talking points were too consistent across different cities. Jennifer Walsh's investigation revealed that many of the protesters were paid by organizations with connections to Strategic Solutions Group. But the network's biggest mistake was underestimating the community that had formed around Sarah's movement. Parents, educators, and reform advocates had been watching the attempts to silence her, and they were organizing their own response. The turning point came during a school board meeting in Phoenix, where Sarah was scheduled to speak about implementing anti-corruption measures. The meeting was disrupted by a group of protesters who claimed Sarah was a radical activist trying to destroy traditional values. What the protesters didn't expect was that Tommy would be in the audience and that he would stand up to address the disruption. "My mom isn't radical," the now 9-year-old said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "She's just someone who thinks kids shouldn't be allowed to hurt other kids just because their parents have money. If that makes her radical, then I guess I'm radical too." The moment was captured on video and shared millions of times across social media. But more importantly, it galvanized support for Sarah's cause in ways that formal presentations and legislative testimony never could. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a child psychologist who had been following Tommy's development, later explained the significance of that moment. Tommy's intervention represented something powerful, a child who had been victimized by systemic corruption, standing up to defend the person who had protected him. It demonstrated that the changes Sarah had fought for weren't just about policy. They were about raising a generation of children who wouldn't accept corruption as normal. The network's attempts to discredit Sarah had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing her, they had created a martyr figure and exposed their own existence to federal investigation. Rodriguez later told her that the Phoenix incident had provided crucial evidence for expanding their probe into the wealth protection network. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her battle, one that would involve testifying before Congress about systematic corruption in educational institutions, she realized that her fight had evolved once again. She was no longer just protecting Tommy or even advocating for educational reform. She had become the focal point of a much larger conflict between two visions of America. One where wealth could buy immunity from consequences, and another where justice applied equally to everyone, regardless of their family's bank account. The stakes had never been higher, and Sarah Martinez was just getting started. The marble corridors of the Hart Senate office building felt impossibly grand as Sarah Martinez walked toward the hearing room where she would testify before the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight, Agency Action, Federal Rights, and Federal Courts. 18 months had passed since that rainy Thursday at Lincoln Elementary, and now she was about to address some of the most powerful people in the country about corruption that reached into the highest levels of American society. The hearing, titled Institutional Corruption and the Weaponization of Wealth Against Public Interests, had been called after Agent Rodriguez's investigation revealed evidence that the Wealth Protection Network had been operating in 37 states, involving over 200 wealthy families and countless compromised officials. Sarah wasn't testifying alone. Joining her were Dr. Rebecca Chen, whose research had documented the systematic nature of the corruption; Maria Santos, a former prosecutor who had resigned after being pressured to drop cases involving wealthy defendants; and most surprisingly, Dylan Hartwell, now 13 years old, and prepared to testify about how the network had operated within his own family. The inclusion of Dylan had been controversial. His testimony required special protections for a minor witness, and his father, Marcus, now serving a federal sentence for tax evasion and environmental crimes, had fought desperately to prevent it. But Dylan had insisted on participating, supported by his mother Catherine, who had divorced Marcus and become an unexpected ally in exposing the network. "I need to tell people what really happened," Dylan had told Sarah during their preparation session. "My dad didn't just teach me to be a bully. He paid people to make sure I could be a bully without consequences. That's not normal, and other kids need to know that." The hearing room was packed with media representatives, activists, and families who had been affected by similar corruption. Sarah spotted Tommy in the gallery, sitting with her mother and Jennifer Walsh. At 13, Tommy had become an articulate advocate for educational justice, but today he was simply a son supporting his mother. Committee Chairman Senator Patricia Reynolds called the hearing to order, her voice carrying the gravity of the moment. "We're here today to examine allegations that wealthy individuals and families have systematically corrupted educational and judicial institutions to protect their children from consequences while targeting children from less privileged backgrounds. If these allegations are true, they represent a fundamental assault on the principle of equal justice under law." The first witness was Dr. Chen, who presented statistical evidence that painted a disturbing picture. Her research had documented over 15,000 cases where children from wealthy families had escaped consequences for serious misconduct, while children from working-class families faced disproportionate punishment for minor infractions. The pattern is consistent across all regions and demographics, Dr. Chen testified. Wealth doesn't just provide better legal representation, it provides access to a parallel system of justice that operates according to different rules. Maria Santos followed with testimony about prosecutorial pressure and judicial corruption that made several committee members visibly uncomfortable. "I was told repeatedly that certain families were off-limits," Santos testified, "not because their children were innocent, but because prosecuting them would be problematic for my career. When I refused to drop a case involving serious assault, by a wealthy teenager, I found myself under investigation for ethics violations that were ultimately found to be baseless, but not before my reputation was destroyed. Then it was Dylan's turn. The teenager approached the witness table with visible nervousness, but his voice was steady when he began to speak. "My name is Dylan Hartwell, and I used to be a bully," he said simply. "But I wasn't just any bully. My family paid money to make sure I could hurt other kids without getting in trouble." The room was completely silent as Dylan described the network's operations from the inside. He explained how his father had received regular reports about his behavior at school, how problems were handled before they became official incidents, and how other children were discouraged or prevented from reporting his actions. "They made me think I was special, that I was better than other kids because we had money," Dylan continued. "But what they really did was teach me that hurting people was okay, as long as you could pay to avoid consequences. That's not being special, that's being a monster." His most devastating testimony came when he described a conference call he had overheard between his father and other network members, discussing strategies for dealing with the Martinez problem. "They talked about Mrs. Martinez like she was a criminal for protecting her son," Dylan said, his voice breaking slightly. "They said she was getting above her station and needed to be put back in her place. That's when I realized that everything I'd been taught about fairness and justice was a lie." When Dylan finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the hearing room. Senator Reynolds had to call for a brief recess as several committee members struggled to compose themselves. Finally, it was Sarah's turn. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with legal experts and policy advisors to craft testimony that would translate her experience into concrete policy recommendations. But as she sat at the witness table, looking out at the packed hearing room, she decided to speak from her heart instead of her notes. "Senators, I'm here today because I made a simple decision. I decided to protect my child. I had no idea that decision would lead me to discover a criminal conspiracy that has been operating in plain sight for decades." She spoke about the loneliness of being invisible, about the courage it took to step forward when every system seemed designed to silence her, and about the responsibility that came with having a platform to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. "The network we've exposed today isn't just about bullying in schools," Sarah continued. "It's about a fundamental question. What kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a nation where your child's future depends on your bank account balance? Where is justice for sale to the highest bidder? Where being poor means accepting that your child will be victimized by those with more money?" But Sarah's most powerful moment came when she addressed the attempts to intimidate and silence her. "Over the past year, I've been threatened, investigated, and attacked by some of the most powerful people in this country. They've tried to destroy my reputation, my livelihood, and my family. And you know what I learned from all of that? I learned that when powerful people try so hard to silence you, it means you're telling a truth they desperately don't want heard." The questioning that followed was intense. Senator Michael Thornton, known for his aggressive interrogation style, attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by focusing on her lack of formal education and professional credentials. "Ms. Martinez, you're asking us to overhaul our educational and judicial systems based on your interpretation of events. What qualifies you to make such sweeping recommendations?" Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. "Senator, what qualifies me is that I've lived the reality that your other witnesses have only studied. I've seen how the system fails ordinary families while protecting the wealthy. I've experienced firsthand how institutions that are supposed to serve the public actually serve private interests. And most importantly, I've proven that ordinary people can fight back and win when they have the courage to speak truth to power." She paused, looking directly at Thornton. "The question isn't what qualifies me to be here. The question is, what disqualified the people who created this corrupt system to believe they could operate without accountability for so long. The exchange was captured on video and immediately went viral, with millions of viewers sharing Sarah's response across social media platforms. But more importantly, it marked a turning point in the hearing. When Senator Reynolds asked Sarah what specific changes she wanted to see, Sarah presented a comprehensive reform package that had been developed with input from legal experts, education, advocates, and corruption researchers across the country. The proposals included mandatory transparency in school disciplinary actions, federal oversight of educational institutions that received public funding, criminal penalties for officials who accepted bribes to protect wealthy students, and most importantly, protection for whistleblowers who exposed institutional corruption. We need to create a system where doing the right thing is rewarded, not punished, Sarah concluded, where protecting children matters more than protecting donors, where the truth is more powerful than money. As the hearing concluded, Sarah realized that she had crossed another threshold. She was no longer just a single mother who had fought back against bullies. She had become a symbol of resistance against a system that had operated in darkness for too long. The real battle was just beginning. 2 years after Sarah Martinez first stood up to bullies in a school parking lot, she walked across the stage at Harvard University to receive her master's degree in public policy. In the audience, Tommy, now 15 and student body president at Lincoln High School, cheered louder than anyone else. The congressional hearing had triggered sweeping changes across the country. The Martinez Protection Act, as it came to be known, established federal oversight of educational institutions and created criminal penalties for wealth-based corruption. Within 6 months, over 300 officials had been indicted, and the Wealth Protection Network had been completely dismantled. Marcus Hartwell was serving 8 years in federal prison. Robert Morrison had fled the country to avoid prosecution. William Phillips had cooperated with authorities and received a reduced sentence of 2 years, but their children had found different paths. Dylan Hartwell, now 17, had become a youth advocate for anti-bullying programs. His foundation, funded by his mother's divorce settlement, had helped implement Sarah's reforms in over 500 schools. Connor Phillips was studying social work, determined to help children from troubled backgrounds. Even Jake Morrison, despite his father's flight, had transformed himself into a peer counselor at his new school. The most unexpected development came from Tommy himself. The quiet, frightened 8-year-old had evolved into a confident teenager who used his story to inspire other children facing bullies. His book, Finding My Voice, A Kid's Guide to Standing Up to Bullies, had become a bestseller, with proceeds funding scholarships for children from low-income families. My mum taught me that being afraid is normal, Tommy said during his graduation speech as valedictorian, but staying afraid is a choice. And sometimes the best way to stop being afraid is to protect someone else who's even more scared than you are. Sarah's own transformation was complete. The woman who had once cleaned offices in silence now directed a national foundation dedicated to fighting institutional corruption. Her methods had been adopted by activist groups worldwide, and the phrase "pulling a Martinez" had entered common usage to describe using insider knowledge to expose systematic wrongdoing. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during a chance encounter at a coffee shop near Harvard. Sarah was reviewing policy papers when someone approached her table. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Martinez?" She looked up to see a young mother with a child who couldn't have been older than 6. "My daughter Emma was being bullied at school by kids whose parents are major donors," the woman said. "The administration wouldn't help us. But then I remembered your story. I started documenting everything, just like you did. Last week, 3 teachers were fired and the principal resigned. Emma feels safe at school again." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to thank you for showing me that ordinary people like us don't have to stay silent." As Sarah watched the mother and daughter walk away, she realized that her greatest victory wasn't the legislation or the awards or even the degrees. It was knowing that somewhere, every day, another parent was finding the courage to protect their child because they had seen that it was possible to fight back and win. That evening, as she and Tommy walked through Harvard Yard discussing his college applications, Tommy asked her a question that brought everything full circle. "Mom, do you ever regret speaking up that day? Everything that came after was pretty intense." Sarah smiled, thinking of all the battles fought and won, all the children protected, all the corrupt systems exposed and reformed. "Tommy, the only thing I regret is waiting so long to find my voice, but I'm grateful that when I finally did, it was to protect you." Years later, historians would mark Sarah Martinez's stand in that school parking lot as a turning point in American social justice, the moment when one mother's love for her child sparked a movement that transformed how power operates in America. But for Sarah, it would always be simpler than that. It was the day she decided that no child should have to suffer in silence while their tormentors were protected by wealth and privilege. It was the day she chose courage over fear, and that choice changed everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.